The flames were the color of rust and regret. They rose high into the gray morning sky, fed by cloth, leather, and the ghosts of belief. The women stood in silence, their faces half lit by the burning heap before them. The insignias, the eagle crests, the tailored coats of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the black skirts of the SS Helferinnen, all devoured by fire. Behind them, Allied soldiers watched without words. No shouts, no laughter, no vengeance. Just the crackling of uniforms that had once defined lives, and now marked the death of an idea. It was the spring of 1945. The Reich had fallen. Across a broken Germany, towns smoldered, cities bled, and the survivors moved through the ruins like shadows of a vanished empire. For the women who had served it, in offices, in signals corps, in field hospitals and command posts, there was no victory, no glory, only reckoning. And for the first time, the war asked them a question they could not answer with duty or obedience. What happens when the symbol you wore becomes the evidence of your guilt? If these stories from the ashes of the Third Reich haunt you, if you want to understand what those final days truly looked like, through the eyes of those who watched their world collapse, then subscribe, share, and stay until the end. Because this is not just about uniforms burned in the dirt. It's about what remained after the smoke cleared. It began not with gunfire, but with static. The women at the communications office in Kassel sat at their desks, headsets pressed tight to their ears, listening to a hum that stretched on endlessly. For years, their lives had been defined by that sound. The clipped orders, the coded transmissions, the rhythm of voices that kept the Reich moving like a machine. But that morning in late April 1945, the machine went silent. Anna Weiss, once a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, turned the tuning dial until her fingers ached. Nothing. No voice from Berlin. No orders from command. Only the soft, stuttering noise of a world breaking apart. Around her, the other women exchanged glances but said nothing. Speaking too much, even now, felt dangerous, as though words themselves might summon retribution. Outside, the air smelled of burnt metal. The city had been bombed for weeks, reduced to blackened stone and twisted iron. Every window was cracked, every road lined with wreckage. Yet for the first time, there was no siren, no warning of what was coming next. The war had slipped into a strange limbo, no longer advancing, not yet finished. Anna looked at her uniform, the gray-green jacket with its faded eagle crest, the armband that once felt like armor. Now it felt like a curse. She thought of the stories whispered in the shelters, that Allied soldiers were closing in, that the Führer had vanished beneath the ruins of Berlin, that surrender might come at any hour. But no one dared say the word aloud. A young typist named Hilda broke the silence first. "What if the war is over?" she said softly. Her voice trembled. "What if no one's left to tell us what to do?" The older women turned sharply toward her. "Don't talk like that," one hissed. "You don't know who's listening." But even as she said it, her eyes flicked nervously toward the dead radio. By noon, the office had emptied. Papers lay scattered across the floor, typewriters half covered with dust. The officers who once barked orders were gone. Some had fled, others had changed into civilian clothes and vanished into the countryside. Those who remained waited for something. A signal, a final command. Anything that could tell them what they were now supposed to be. When dusk fell, Anna walked through the ruined streets toward the river. Smoke curled up from the industrial district, painting the horizon in dull orange. The bridges were littered with abandoned trucks, crates of ammunition, and the corpses of half-burned documents. She passed a group of Luftwaffe cadets, barely older than boys, sitting on the curb with cigarettes dangling from their lips. They looked at her uniform, then quickly looked away. That night, the sound of boots faded from the cobblestones. The marching songs that once echoed through every street were gone. In their place was the creak of shutters, the bark of dogs, the whisper of frightened families packing what little they had. The war had not ended. It had dissolved. In the days that followed, rumors became more powerful than truth. Some said the Americans were already in Frankfurt. Others claimed the British were arresting anyone in uniform, even the women. In one town, an SS convoy had allegedly been massacred after refusing to surrender. In another, a German field hospital had raised a white flag and been spared. No one knew which story to believe. Anna hid her insignia inside a drawer. She stared at the empty space on her sleeve where it once had been, and felt something she couldn't name. Not relief, not shame, but a hollow quietness, as if her identity had slipped away with it. For years, she had believed she was serving order, not ideology. But now she began to wonder, had she ever really known the difference? On the third day, the Allied planes stopped bombing. The skies, once filled with the thunder of engines, were suddenly calm. The silence was so profound that it frightened people. They had lived too long in noise, in the crash of artillery, the roar of speeches, the endless music of propaganda. Now, without it, they felt the emptiness closing in. At dawn, Anna stood outside her billet and watched the first column of American tanks roll through the main street. The soldiers wore expressions she couldn't read. Weary, wary, almost human. They did not shout or threaten. They simply moved forward, weapons at their sides, scanning the ruins like archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. A jeep stopped near her. A young American sergeant stepped out, his uniform dusted with ash. He looked at her. Not with hatred, but with something colder. Detachment. She realized in that moment that he did not see an enemy or a soldier. He saw a remnant, a survivor of something already dead. "Get inside," he said in rough German. "Curfew. No one in uniform outside." She nodded quickly and turned away, her breath catching. The last order she ever received in uniform had come from a foreign voice. That night, she lay awake, listening to the river outside. Somewhere across the water, she could hear faint singing. A song she didn't recognize, in a language she didn't speak. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't mourning. It was just alive. For the first time since the war began, she realized she could not hear the sound of the Reich anymore. No radios, no orders, no voices demanding belief, only the soft whisper of the river moving on, indifferent to everything it had seen. And in that silence, Anna finally understood what defeat truly meant. Not destruction, not surrender, but the moment when even obedience loses its purpose. The orders had stopped, but captivity had its own rhythm. The first American trucks rolled into Kassel under a sky the color of cold tin. By then, every German soldier who hadn't fled was a prisoner, and those who wore the gray-green uniform, men or women, were gathered up with the same methodical efficiency the Wehrmacht once prided itself on. The women were herded into an abandoned train yard, where freight cars had been converted into makeshift holding pens. The smell of oil and scorched wood lingered in the air, blending with the stench of fear. Anna Weiss stood among them, one face in a sea of confusion. Some women still clung to their uniforms, polishing buttons as if dignity could be scrubbed clean. Others tore insignias from their sleeves and trampled them into the dirt. One girl, no older than 18, sobbed into her hands until her voice cracked. A former nurse held her, whispering that everything would be fine, though no one believed it. When the gates clanged shut behind them, silence fell. Then came the voices, English, quick and sharp, issuing commands through interpreters. "Line up, hands visible. No talking." The women obeyed instinctively. Years of training had wired obedience into their bodies. Even now, in the hands of their enemies, they moved like soldiers. The first interrogations began that afternoon. One by one, the women were called into a small building at the edge of the yard. Inside, American officers sat at wooden tables beneath flickering lamps. They asked the same questions over and over. Name, rank. Where were you stationed? Did you know about the camps? Anna's turn came near dusk. She stepped into the room, her boots squelching on the wet floor. The officer before her looked barely 30. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. A translator sat beside him, a young woman with pale hair and tired eyes. Name? The translator asked. Anna Weiss. Position? Funkerin. Radio operator. The officer leaned forward. For which unit? The 16th Wehrmacht Signals Regiment. He wrote something down, then looked up again. You were in Kassel during the bombings? Yes. Did you send or receive any transmissions about prisoner movements or concentration camps? Her mouth went dry. No, I only handled troop reports. The officer watched her carefully. Then, almost softly, did you ever hear messages about what was happening to the Jews? Anna hesitated. For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, alive with unspoken truths. She wanted to say no, to insist that she had been only a worker, a cog, a bystander. But in the quiet of her mind, she remembered fragments of static, half-decoded phrases, rumors passed between operators when the lines went silent. Transports east. Special actions. Total cleansing. Words that had meant nothing then and everything now. No, she whispered. I didn't know. The officer didn't argue. He only nodded once and signaled for the guard to escort her out. Outside, the night was cold. The women huddled together beside a small fire they had built from scrap wood. Someone had found a piece of broken mirror and was staring into it, as if to confirm they still existed. The flickering light turned their faces into shifting ghosts, proud one second, broken the next. Hilda, the young typist from the radio office, sat beside Anna, her knees drawn to her chest. They look at us like we're all the same, she murmured. Like we wore the same face as the men who did the killing. Anna stared into the flames. Maybe that's what they see, the uniform, not the person. But we didn't shoot anyone, Hilda said, her voice cracking. We only typed. We followed orders. Anna looked at her, and for a long time didn't answer. Because deep down she knew the truth. That wars were not just fought with weapons. They were carried by those who built the systems, who obeyed without question, who believed that doing one's duty was enough. Days passed. The women were moved again, marched through the countryside under the gaze of townspeople who spat as they passed. Some called them monsters, others traitors, but a few just stared in silence, too hollowed out to feel anything at all. The roads were lined with wrecked tanks and burned-out trucks. The empire they had served now existed only as rubble and smoke. At one small village, an old woman stepped out of her doorway and threw a loaf of bread toward them. It fell into the mud and broke apart. None of the guards stopped it. Anna picked up a piece and passed it to Hilda. It was still warm. That night, in a temporary camp surrounded by barbed wire, Anna lay awake listening to the muffled sobs of the others. Somewhere in the darkness, an American soldier played a harmonica, a slow, mournful tune that drifted through the air like a ghost of something human. It reminded her that the world outside the war still existed. Music, kindness, life beyond survival. When the morning came, the guards handed out thin blankets and orders. The women were to be transferred to a larger facility near Göttingen, where they would await processing. Before they boarded the trucks, an officer stepped forward and gave one final instruction. Remove your insignia, he said. All of them. No one spoke. One by one, the women reached for their sleeves, tearing away the symbols that had once given them purpose. Eagles, lightning bolts, swastikas, ranks. The wind caught a few of the patches and carried them across the field, scattering them like dead leaves. Anna watched hers land in the mud. It sank halfway into the earth and disappeared. For a strange, fleeting moment, she felt lighter, as if a part of her had been buried too. But as the trucks roared to life and the convoy moved forward, she looked back at the empty yard behind them. The smoke, the ruins, the hollow buildings, all of it receding into the distance. And she realized that the past was not something you could simply strip off or throw away. It clung to you, invisible and heavy, long after the uniform was gone. The trucks stopped at dawn. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet grass and oil. The convoy had arrived at a former Luftwaffe base, now converted into a temporary camp. Barbed wire coiled like metal vines around the perimeter. Inside, tents and makeshift barracks sprawled across the muddy field, guarded by watchtowers where American soldiers smoked in silence, their silhouettes outlined against the gray morning sky. Anna and the others climbed down slowly, exhausted from days of transport. Their uniforms, once pressed and proper, were now creased, stained, and heavy with the scent of sweat and ash. They were lined up again, counted, catalogued, and led toward the center of the compound, where a small crowd of officers stood waiting. Behind them, on a flat stretch of ground, a pile of wooden crates and broken furniture had been arranged in a rough circle, the beginnings of something that looked like a pyre. No one explained at first. The women stood silently as a British officer, his expression calm but unreadable, stepped forward. He spoke through an interpreter in clipped tones that carried across the morning air. All captured uniforms bearing Nazi insignia are to be destroyed. You will burn them yourselves. The order is final. A ripple of unease passed through the group. Some women exchanged looks. Others stood rigid, expressionless. A few clutched at their coats instinctively, as if afraid someone might tear them away. The officer gestured toward the pile of crates. "Gather your clothing there. Do it now!" There was no shouting, no cruelty in his voice, only an administrative certainty. That made it worse. The words didn't sound like punishment. They sounded like procedure. Anna's hands trembled as she unbuttoned her jacket. The fabric felt foreign now, almost obscene. The eagle crest above her breast pocket caught a sliver of light before she tore it free. Around her, dozens of other women were doing the same, removing caps, belts, armbands, insignias. The air filled with the sound of cloth tearing and buttons clattering to the ground. A young woman nearby, Fräulein Köhler, an SS auxiliary who had once worked in a Berlin administrative office, refused. She stood stiff, her eyes blazing. "I will not burn it," she said. "It's my uniform. I served honorably," the interpreter translated. The British officer regarded her for a long moment. "Then you'll watch it burn." He nodded to two guards, who stepped forward and took the jacket from her shoulders. She didn't resist, but her eyes followed it as they threw it onto the growing pile. For the first time, she looked small. When the order came to light the fire, the scene unfolded without drama. Only the eerie precision of duty reversed. A soldier struck a match, touched it to the pile, and stepped back. The flames caught quickly, feeding on dry cloth and splintered wood. At first, no one moved. The women stood in a half-circle, faces lit by the glow. The fire crackled and snapped, and black smoke began to curl into the air. Then one woman stepped forward and threw her jacket in. Another followed. Then another. Soon the fire was alive, roaring, spitting sparks into the wind. Buttons melted like silver tears. Leather boots twisted and blackened. The eagle crests shriveled into unrecognizable fragments before crumbling to ash. Anna watched her own uniform disappear, feeling the heat on her face. She thought of the years spent inside that gray shell, the hours spent relaying messages, obeying, believing she was only serving her country. Now it looked like nothing more than fuel for someone else's flame. Hilda stood beside her, arms crossed, her expression hollow. "It smells like rubber," she whispered. "It smells like everything burning," Anna replied. The officer gave no further orders. He simply watched as they carried out the task, as if letting them decide for themselves what the act meant. Around the circle, faces flickered in the firelight. Anger, shame, disbelief, relief. Some cried quietly. Some stared straight ahead, unblinking. One woman knelt suddenly and began to shovel ashes with her hands, as if searching for something that might have survived. A guard pulled her away gently, but she screamed as if part of her had been taken with it. When the last uniform was gone, the fire was allowed to die on its own. No one spoke. The women drifted away in small groups, their steps slow, their eyes distant. The ashes remained, a gray mound that still smoked faintly in the wind. That night, the sky above the camp glowed with the faint red of distant fires from nearby towns. The women sat in their tents, wrapped in blankets, their bodies shivering more from emptiness than from cold. Without uniforms, they looked alike, stripped of rank, of identity, of the illusion that there had ever been purpose in what they'd done. Anna lay awake, watching shadows move across the canvas walls. In the silence, she could still hear the crackling fire, the soft hiss as wool turned to smoke. The sound repeated in her mind like a heartbeat. When she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed of the burning. But in her dream, it wasn't just uniforms. It was maps, radios, flags, the entire machinery of the Reich consumed by fire, reduced to drifting ash that settled over the fields like gray snow. In the morning, she woke to find a thin layer of that same ash coating the camp. It clung to the canvas, to the grass, to their hair and skin. They brushed it away, but it returned with every breath. The guards didn't mention the burning again. There was no ceremony, no explanation. It was as if the event had never happened. But something had changed. The women no longer stood in lines. They no longer saluted when officers passed. They moved more slowly, as though uncertain how to walk without orders. Anna went to the edge of the compound and looked beyond the wire. In the distance she could see a village, its church steeple half collapsed, its fields covered in fog. For the first time in years, she saw no flags, no banners, no symbols. Only the plain, wounded earth, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath the guilt, beneath the exhaustion, she felt a quiet, fragile sense of release. The uniform had burned, but perhaps in its ashes, something human might grow again. The camp was quieter after the burning. Days bled together, marked only by the distant sound of trucks, the crack of boots on gravel, and the faint ringing of church bells from the nearby village. The fire had stripped more than cloth from the women. It had taken away the scaffolding of belief that had held them upright for so long. Without uniforms, ranks, or insignia, they were no longer soldiers. But they weren't civilians either. They were something in between. Fragments of a fallen order drifting through a landscape that no longer wanted them. Anna Weiss spent her mornings scrubbing the barracks floors under the watch of Allied guards. The work was monotonous, but it gave her a rhythm, something to fill the empty space where command once lived. Each brushstroke against the concrete seemed to erase a little more of what had been. Yet every so often, she would catch herself humming one of the old marching tunes under her breath, and the shame that followed would hit her like a wave. She would stop, close her eyes, and wait for the feeling to pass. Hilda worked beside her, quieter now than she had been in Kassel. The young typist's laughter, once nervous but bright, had vanished. One morning, Anna found her staring through the wire fence, watching a group of children playing in the distant field. Their clothes were torn, their faces pale, but they were laughing, chasing each other through the spring mud as if the world had never known war. Hilda turned and whispered, "They don't even know who we were." Anna didn't answer. She envied them. Their ignorance, their freedom from the weight of what had come before. The Allies had begun releasing some of the prisoners, those deemed harmless, those with families to return to, those whose names appeared clean in the endless files of captured intelligence. But for others, especially those who had worked in administrative or communications roles, the interrogations continued. The war might have ended, but judgment had only begun. One afternoon, Anna was summoned again. The same officer as before, this time without the translator. His German was rough but clear enough. "We're gathering testimony," he said. "You were a radio operator. You must have heard things," she hesitated. "I sent messages. I didn't know what they meant." He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You knew enough." His words were not cruel, but they cut deeper than accusation. They left no room for defense. He was right. She had known enough to sense that the war was not what it claimed to be, enough to suspect that the talk of transports and cleansing meant something unspeakable. But she had silenced those thoughts then, buried them under duty and fear. Now they surfaced in fragments. The memory of static on the line, of coded numbers, of words whispered in corridors when officers thought no one could hear. When she left the tent, she felt the weight of the sky pressing down. A storm was gathering in the distance, dark clouds swallowing the horizon. She walked to the edge of the compound and stood beneath the wind, letting the first drops of rain fall on her face. For a moment, she wished it would all wash away. The war, the guilt, the memory of fire. But the rain could only clean the surface. Beneath, the stain remained. That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed the camp, thunder rolling over the hills like artillery. The women huddled inside their tents, whispering prayers they had forgotten they knew. The sound of wind against the canvas reminded Anna of the bomb shelters. The same helpless waiting. The same feeling that life and death were no longer separate things, but threads woven through the same cloth. When dawn came, the camp was half flooded. Mud clung to every boot, every step. The ash from the burned uniforms had turned into black streaks that ran down the earth like veins. Anna knelt by one of the puddles and saw her reflection. Pale, hollow-eyed, unrecognizable. For the first time, she realized how young she still was, and how much of herself had been spent believing in something that never existed. The days that followed brought something new. Education sessions, the guards called them. Lectures, films, photographs, proof. At first, many of the women refused to look. They called them lies, exaggerations, Allied propaganda. But the evidence kept coming. Camp after camp, name after name, images that no one could deny. When the projector flickered in the barracks, Anna forced herself to watch. She saw what the words transport and cleansing had truly meant. She saw what obedience had built. Around her, some women wept. Others sat rigid, silent. Hilda covered her face and didn't speak for hours. That night, Anna walked out to the fence and pressed her hands against the cold metal. The moon hung low, pale and distant. She whispered into the dark, not to anyone, but to the silence itself. "We built this," she said. "We didn't pull the trigger, but we carried the bullets." A guard passed nearby but didn't stop her. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't need to. From that night on, Anna began to write. Not for anyone else, but for herself. She scrawled words onto scraps of paper, ration wrappers, even the backs of Allied leaflets. Not reports, not confessions. Just fragments, images, the smell of the radio room, the sound of a voice she would never identify, the feeling of the fire against her skin. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps to remember, perhaps to ensure she never forgot. Weeks later, as the first release lists were read, Hilda's name appeared. Anna's did not. They embraced briefly, neither knowing what to say. As Hilda boarded the truck that would take her away, she turned and whispered, "Maybe we'll meet again, somewhere clean." Anna nodded, though she knew the word clean had lost its meaning. When the truck disappeared beyond the hills, she went back to her tent and sat in silence, holding the small pieces of paper she had written. She folded them neatly and placed them in a tin box, the only thing she had kept from her old life. Outside, the sun was rising again over the camp, pale and soft against the smoke-stained sky. The war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. When summer finally reached the wire, It did not arrive with trumpets or banners. It came as dust rising from the road, as green pushing through cratered fields, as the steady hum of trucks that brought bread one day and barbed wire the next. The camp shrank as names were called, week after week, and the women left in small groups, stepping through the gate like sleepwalkers crossing a boundary only they could see. Each departure thinned the air, made the barracks echo more loudly when the wind moved. The fire was long dead, but its ash had found new places to live. In the seams of canvas, in the grooves of boots, in the space between one breath and the next. Anna Weiss learned to wait without watching the gate. She learned the work rhythms of people who no longer belonged to an army. Scrub, lift, carry, cook, mend, sleep, rise, repeat. In the afternoons, she was sometimes sent with a supervised detail to the village to haul bricks from a collapsed school. The church bell had been rehung on a half-broken frame. When it sounded, the note carried the wobble of bent metal, as if memory itself could be dented but not destroyed. The villagers looked at her now with less heat and more distance, measuring the shape of a future that would have to include even those who had burned their pasts on command. Word of the world seeped through the fence in fragments. Berlin was a scar. Hamburg had burned and then drowned. The Wehrmacht no longer existed, except in courtrooms and in the mouths of men who insisted they'd only followed orders. The Nuremberg trials were a rumor at first, then a fact, then a broadcast, and one afternoon the guards set up a clattering radio in the canteen and told the prisoners to listen. The English rolled and broke like waves. An interpreter repeated the words in flat German, each sentence a door closing. Names fell like stones into a well. Göring, Kaltenbrunner, Jodl, Keitel. Anna watched the faces of the women around her as they heard of crimes that had been whispered about, guessed at, denied. The room filled with a sound she would never forget, not weeping, not outrage, but the collapse of certainty. The breath leaving a belief and not returning. That evening, she sat outside the barracks with her tin box and the fragments she had written. She read them under a weak bulb while moths battered themselves against the light. The pages no longer felt like confessions. They felt like witness. She added lines she had not yet had the courage to write. The way her fingers used to warm on the radio valves in winter. How the code keys could sound like rain. How a single phrase, transports east, could grow heavier each month until the words themselves became a weight she carried in her chest. Release, when it came, did not look like freedom. An officer in a khaki shirt called her name in a dry voice and handed her a paper stamped with a date and a destination. She received a small ration parcel, a threadbare civilian dress, and a few coins that clinked like apology. The gate slid open. The road ahead was a ribbon of dust running between fields that had once been sown with slogans and were now simply waiting for seed. She walked with two other women in silence until the wire and the guard towers were no longer visible behind them, and then they spoke the way people speak after long illness, carefully, as if words could bruise. They found a train by following the smell of coal to a siding where carriages stood like wounded animals. The car they entered was full of faces that knew the same weather. Displaced persons, widows with children, farmers without farms, men who had never owned a uniform and yet were judged by uniforms all the same. Someone shared an apple. Someone else a story that ended before it could arrive at hope. In the corner sat a woman humming a lullaby to no one, keeping time with the rhythm of iron on iron. The train moved at last, the countryside passing like pages torn from a book and thrown into the wind. Kassel was not a city when she returned to it. It was a library of broken spines. Streets she had walked in the old uniform were now corridors through a museum of absence. The radio office was a slab of concrete, the billets a charred rectangle mapped by weeds. She found the house where she had rented a room by the way sunlight fell through the missing roof. The owner had gone east months earlier and never returned. For a night she slept in the stairwell beneath the open sky, counting stars through ribs of wood. And in the morning she joined the Trimmerfrauen, the women who made a new nation out of rubble and will. They taught her how to sort brick from limestone, how to feel with her fingertips which pieces could be reused and which must be ground to foundation dust. They moved in lines, passing stone in a steady cadence, their bodies learning a new drill that did not require salutes. The first time a child in the ruins laughed at a joke she could not hear, the sound startled her so much that she dropped a brick and burst into tears. No one scolded her. A woman with gray in her hair placed a hand on her shoulder, and that simple human touch felt like water after a long desert. The day's work left her hands cut and bleeding. But the pain was clean, unlike the old kind that lived beneath the skin and could not be washed away. At night, she rented a corner of a crowded flat and kept her tin box beneath the thin mattress. The papers inside began to multiply. She wrote when there was light, and she wrote in the dark by memory, shaping sentences in her head and pressing them into the day the way a seal presses a crest into wax. She did not write about innocence. She no longer believed in the word. She wrote about omission and its cousins, convenience, fear, habit. She wrote about how uniforms do not pull triggers, but they make it easier for hands to forget what they are. She wrote about the day the orders stopped, and how the silence showed her the shape of her own obedience. Hilda found her after a long winter, a winter of hunger, of coal dust scouring lungs, of bread lines that wrote the geography of survival across the city. She appeared at the edge of a rubble crew one afternoon, thinner, older, but with the same light in her eyes that had once asked forbidden questions beside a dead radio. They embraced without words, then sat on a broken step and shared a slice of black bread with the care of people who honor small rituals because larger ones have failed them. Hilda had been working in a hospital, lifting men out of nightmares and back into the thin daylight of the new world. She spoke of patients who could not sleep when the wind rattled windows, of nurses who had learned to hum not to soothe others, but to steady themselves. "Do you think it ends?" Hilda asked. "The reckoning, I mean." Anna looked at her raw palms. "I think it changes shape." They carried bricks together for an hour without speaking, and when they parted, they did not say goodbye. War had taught them not to trust endings. There were only distances, and the faith that some of them could be crossed. The years after that did what years do. They layered themselves over the first wound until scar became landscape. There were elections, new flags, new anthems that rose carefully, aware of the echo they would have to overcome. There were trials, and there were men who claimed they had never known, and there were women who never spoke again about the days when they wore gray-green and listened to orders through a headset like prayer. Anna worked in a library that grew from a single room into a building with warmth in winter. She shelved books about the war that told the truth too plainly for some and not plainly enough for others. Every so often, she would see a photograph she could not turn away from. A train car, a field, a gate with words made of iron. And she would go home and take out her tin box and add one more page that did not try to explain, only to witness. When she was asked once by a young man, a student with hands unscarred by rubble, what it had felt like to burn her uniform, she told him the simple thing and not the complicated one. She said it felt like standing between two mirrors and seeing yourself grow smaller until you almost disappeared. He waited for more, but she had learned that some truths live in the spaces between sentences. She placed a book in his hands, not about battles, not about generals, but about signals and their meanings, the way language can carry both orders and lies without changing weight. On a spring morning, many years after the gate had opened, Anna walked to the river and stood where a bridge had once groaned beneath troop trucks. The city around her had windows again, that held the sky properly, and children ran with kites that refused the discipline of straight lines. She thought of the camp and the fire and the ash that coated the world like a second skin. She thought of the officer who had told her to burn the emblem she had once touched like a blessing, and she understood finally what had unsettled her about his voice. It had not been hatred. It had been the steadiness of someone performing a ritual of unmaking, of returning symbols to the dust they had always been. The wind lifted across the water and turned the river's surface into 1,000 small knives of light. She closed her eyes and let the past come, not as a verdict now, but as weather, arriving, passing, arriving again. When she opened them, she saw her reflection, older and ordinary, a face like any other in a nation of faces relearning how to belong to themselves. Somewhere behind her, a church bell rang with a clean note. It sounded nothing like the radios of her youth, nothing like the drumbeat of parades, nothing like the crackle of uniforms feeding a pyre. It sounded like a boundary crossed and then kept, not a wall, but a line remembered. She stood and listened until the last tremor faded. If there was a lesson that could be spoken aloud, she did not trust it. But she knew this. The uniform had burned because it was only cloth. What remained, the parts that could harm or heal, were carried out of the fire in the bodies of those who had watched, who had obeyed, who had learned to live with silence, and then to use their voices without turning them into orders. On her way home, she passed a school where children were reciting the alphabet in a chorus that stuttered and then smoothed out. She paused and listened from the gate, a witness to the ordinary miracle of repetition that builds a language without bending it into a weapon. A teacher saw her and nodded. She nodded back and moved on. In the small room with the clean window, she opened the tin box one final time and read each page by the light of afternoon. Outside, the day went on with its patient work. Carts rattling, bicycles clicking past, footsteps on stairs that had been rebuilt by hands that had lifted stone after stone. When she was done, she placed the pages in an envelope and sealed it. She wrote no return address. Some truths were not hers to own, only to deliver. She stepped into the hallway and handed the envelope to a postman, whose bag was heavy with letters from a country learning again how to speak to itself. He touched his cap, not as a salute, but as a courtesy, and she felt a small, unremarkable joy that the simple gesture could mean only what it meant. The door closed softly behind her. The room filled with the ordinary light of a city that had refused to stay a ruin. In that light, the past did not vanish. It stood where it belonged, behind her, visible, accounted for. And in front of her was a table, a loaf of bread, a cup, a window that opened, and a sky that held no banners at all.